The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. Maya Reeves had learned to stop noticing it somewhere around her 14th hour on shift, the same way she had learned to stop noticing the ache in her feet or the low, persistent throb behind her eyes that never quite went away anymore. She moved through the hallway on autopilot, her scrubs wrinkled, her dark hair escaping its bun in slow defeat, her clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield against the world. Ward C. Room 412. Medication check. Then, room 41. Then the overnight notes. Then, if the universe was feeling generous, maybe 30 minutes in the break room with a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the burner since noon. She had not slept in 31 hours. It was not unusual. 3 nurses had called in sick this week, and the hospital administration had responded to the staffing crisis with the same solution they always did, asking the ones who showed up to simply be more present, more efficient, more resilient. Maya had been resilient for 6 years. She had been resilient through her mother's illness, through the funeral, through the apartment that still smelled like her mother's perfume 3 months later. She had been resilient through double shifts and missed dinners and a social life that had quietly dissolved into nothing, like sugar in warm water. Tonight, resilience felt very far away. She turned the corner toward the medication station and stopped. The hallway stretched ahead of her, long and white and humming with fluorescent light, and for a moment she could not remember which direction she was supposed to be walking. The clipboard in her hands felt very heavy. The floor seemed to tilt, just slightly, like the deck of a ship catching a slow wave. Maya blinked, put one hand against the wall. The cool surface of it steadied her for a moment, the painted concrete solid and real beneath her palm. She breathed in, breathed out. Down the hall, someone's monitor beeped its steady rhythm. A cart wheeled past a distant intersection. Everything was exactly as it always was. She pushed off the wall and took 3 steps forward. That was all she managed. The clipboard hit the floor first, then her knees. Then the rest of her followed, her body simply deciding without consulting her that it had reached the end of whatever it had left. The fluorescent light above her swam and fractured and went soft at the edges, and Maya Reeves closed her eyes on the hospital floor and did not open them again. She did not hear the footsteps that came. They were not the rubber-soled squeak of nursing shoes or the brisk click of a doctor's dress shoes. They were quiet, almost impossibly quiet for someone moving that fast. The man who turned the corner from the East Wing had no reason to be on Ward C at 11:47 on a Thursday night. He was not a patient. He was not staff. He had walked through the front entrance of St. Crispin's Medical Center 2 hours ago with the particular ease of someone who understood that confidence, worn correctly, was the only badge most people ever checked. His name was not on any admittance form. It was not in any database this hospital kept, or any hospital in this city, or any city that had existed in the last 400 years. The name he used now, Adrian Voss, was 40 years old, a clean identity built with the patience of someone who had learned to think in centuries rather than decades. Before that, there had been other names, other cities, other centuries. He was very old. He did not look it. He turned the corner and stopped. She was on the floor, dark hair fanned around her face, one arm stretched toward the clipboard that had skidded 3 feet from her outstretched fingers. Her chest rose and fell in slow, shallow rhythm. Not dead. He knew the difference between those two things with a certainty that required no examination. But her heartbeat was thin and rapid, and her skin, even from here, had the gray undertone of someone who had been running on nothing for too long. Adrian Voss stood very still for exactly 1 second. In that second, he catalogued the hallway. Empty in both directions. Cameras at the far end, angled toward the nursing station, not this stretch of corridor. Nearest staff member 40 feet away and moving away from them, not toward. The woman on the floor had not cried out when she fell. No one had heard. He crossed the distance between them in 4 strides and crouched beside her. She was younger than he had initially registered. Late 20s, perhaps, the kind of tired that lived in the bones, not just the body. Her name badge read Maya Reeves, Rarn, and below that, in smaller letters, the ward designation and a small round sticker, a yellow smiley face, slightly peeling at one edge. The sticker struck him for a reason he did not immediately examine. He checked her pulse at her wrist. Fast, shallow, consistent with vasovagal syncope. Simple fainting from exhaustion and inadequate caloric intake. He could smell that she had not eaten in many hours. He could smell the coffee she had consumed instead, the adrenaline her body had been burning through like cheap fuel, and beneath all of it, the quiet particular scent of a human being running a deficit they had been ignoring for too long. She needed fluids, food, and approximately 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep. What she was going to get, if he left her here, was a tile floor and a passing orderly and a concerned notation in her file. Adrian slid one arm beneath her knees and one behind her shoulders and stood. She weighed almost nothing. That bothered him more than he expected. The nursing station was 30 feet away. He could hear 3 staff members behind the partition, a phone ringing, the shuffle of paperwork. He turned in the opposite direction, toward the family waiting room he had passed on his way in. Empty at this hour. A couch against the far wall. He moved through the door, settled her onto the cushions with a care that was entirely out of proportion to anything that could be rationally explained, and straightened. Maya Reeves sighed in her sleep and turned her face toward the warmth he had left behind. Adrian stood at the edge of the room and looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked to the door, pulled it almost closed, and went to find a nurse who was not currently unconscious. The nurse he found was a heavy-set woman named Dolores, who had been working Ward C for 11 years and had seen enough strange things that a well-dressed man appearing from nowhere to report a collapsed colleague barely registered as unusual. She followed him to the waiting room, checked Maya's vitals with practiced efficiency, called for a glucose check and a saline drip, and somewhere in the middle of all of it turned to thank the man who had brought her there. The doorway was empty. Dolores looked at it for a moment, then looked back at Maya, then shrugged in the particular way of someone who has decided that some questions are not worth the paperwork. Maya came back to consciousness slowly, the way you surface from deep water, aware of pressure and warmth before you are aware of anything else. The first thing she registered was that she was not on the floor. The second was that something soft was under her head. The third was Dolores's face, creased with the professional concern of someone who was also calculating how this affected the overnight staffing numbers. "There she is," Dolores said. "Easy. Don't sit up yet. I'm fine." Maya's voice came out smaller than she intended. "You fainted in the hallway, honey. You were the opposite of fine." Dolores adjusted the drip line running into Maya's arm. "Somebody found you and brought you in here. You're lucky." Maya blinked at the ceiling. The waiting room. She recognized the water stain in the shape of a boot above the door, had stared at it during enough difficult family conversations to know exactly where she was. "Who found me?" Dolores made a non-committal sound. "Don't know." "Man tall, good-looking, if you're into that." She paused. "Which I am for the record, but he was gone before I could get a name." Maya closed her eyes again. Her head felt strange and hollow, like a room after the furniture has been moved. She had a memory, blurred and uncertain, of warmth, of being lifted, of feeling, for one disorienting moment, completely safe in a way she had not felt in a very long time. She told herself it was the hypoglycemia. She was discharged from the waiting room, if you could call it discharged, at midnight, with strict instructions from Dolores to eat something. Go home. And not come back until her next scheduled shift, which was 36 hours away. Maya sat in her car in the hospital parking structure for 10 minutes, before she trusted herself to drive. The city moved around her, indifferent and glittering, and she thought about her empty apartment and the leftovers she hadn't eaten, and the way the exhaustion had simply taken her knees out from under her without warning, like a debt she had forgotten she owed. She thought about warmth, about being carried. She drove home. The apartment was exactly as she had left it that morning, which meant it was in a state that could generously be described as organized chaos. Her mother's things were still in boxes in the second bedroom. Maya had been meaning to go through them for 3 months. She heated soup she didn't taste, showered in water hotter than was strictly comfortable, and fell into bed still damp, asleep before she had finished the thought she was having. She did not dream. Or if she did, she didn't remember. She went back to the hospital the next day, because she always went back. Not for her scheduled shift, which was still a day away, but because Dr. Farhan needed coverage in the afternoon, and Maya had never in 6 years said no to coverage. She told herself it was financial. The extra hours helped. The truth was simpler and harder to examine. The hospital was the one place where she knew exactly what was required of her, where the parameters of competence were clear and measurable, and someone else's need was always larger and more urgent than her own. She was coming out of the supply room at 3:30 when she saw him. He was standing at the end of the corridor near the window that looked out over the courtyard, his back to her, one hand braced against the frame. Tall, dark coat that was too fine for the fluorescent light and not quite right for the season. The posture of someone entirely accustomed to standing still in places where everyone else was moving. Maya stopped. She didn't know how she knew. She had been unconscious. She hadn't seen a face. But the body remembers things the mind hasn't processed, and something in her chest tightened with a recognition she couldn't rationally explain. She walked toward him. Her shoes squeaked on the tile. He turned before she reached him, as if he had known she was there the whole time, and she got her first look at the face that belonged to the warmth she had been trying not to think about. It was not a face you forgot. That was the first coherent thought she had, angular and pale, with dark eyes that held the particular quality of very old intelligence, not unkind, but deep in a way that felt like looking at something that had been watching the world for long enough to stop being surprised by it. He looked perhaps 35. Something about him suggested that 35 was a significant underestimate. "You're back," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry. "You were here yesterday," Maya said. It came out more certain than she felt. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly. More like recalibration. "You were unconscious." "I know." She held his gaze. "I still know." A pause. Brief. He looked at her with the focused attention of someone reassessing a situation they thought they had correctly read. "How are you feeling?" "Better." She paused. "I didn't get a name." "No." He agreed. "You didn't." The corridor moved around them. A cart wheeled past. A phone rang at the nurse's station. The whole busy and different machinery of the hospital continued without them, and Maya stood in the middle of it and looked at this man who had carried her off the floor and vanished before anyone could thank him, and felt something she couldn't name settle in the space behind her sternum. "I'm Maya," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the ghost of one, the shadow left behind after a smile has passed through a face that doesn't use them often. "I know," he said. "Your badge. And you?" Another pause, longer this time. "Adrian," he said finally. "Do you have a reason to be here, Adrian?" The not quite smile again. "I was checking," he said, "that you were all right." Maya looked at him for a long moment, the rational part of her brain, the part that had been trained to assess and triage and make decisions under pressure, was sending signals she was choosing to ignore. There was no logical reason for a stranger to return to a hospital the day after carrying an unconscious nurse to a waiting room. There was no explanation for the way he had looked at her, not with the quick assessment of someone calculating risk, but with something quieter. Something that felt, impossibly, like relief. "I'm all right," she said. "Good." He said it simply, like a door closing gently on a room that mattered. He nodded once, pushed off from the window frame, and walked toward the east corridor. Maya watched him go. At the corner he paused, just for a moment, and she had the strange and specific sensation that he was aware of her watching, that he was choosing not to turn around. Then he turned the corner, and was gone. Maya stood at the window and looked out at the courtyard, and tried to remember the last time a stranger had made her feel, without doing anything at all, like she was worth returning for. She couldn't. The next time she saw him, she was not at the hospital. It was 6 days later, a Tuesday, the kind of gray autumn morning that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain. Maya was at the farmer's market 2 blocks from her apartment, holding a paper cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, moving between the stalls with the distracted energy of someone who has left the house primarily to prove to herself that she still does things like leave the house. She had thought about Adrian more than she intended to. That was the honest accounting of it. Not obsessively, not in the way of someone building a fantasy, but with the persistent low-frequency attention you give to something that doesn't quite resolve. A loose thread. A word you can't remember the definition of. She had gone back over the corridor encounter with the clinical precision she applied to case notes, and had arrived at no useful conclusion except that the encounter had been strange, and the strangeness had stayed with her. She was looking at apples she didn't need when she saw him across the market. He was not browsing. He was standing at the edge of the square near a coffee cart, watching the crowd with the same quality of attention he had turned on her in the hospital, not predatory, not restless, just profoundly and quietly present. He wore a dark jacket and no scarf despite the cold, and he looked, in the gray morning light, like something that belonged to an older and more serious version of the world. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. Neither of them moved for a beat too long. Maya crossed the market. She told herself she was simply going for more coffee. She told herself this without any real conviction. "You're following me," she said when she reached him, keeping her voice light. "You live 2 blocks away," Adrian said. "I've been coming to this market for 9 years. She looked at him. That's either a coincidence or a very good answer. It's both. The ghost smile. More present this time. "I saw you and didn't leave." That part is deliberate. The honesty of it caught her off guard. She had expected deflection, the smooth social machinery of a man who had learned to manage impressions. Instead, he had simply told the truth, plainly, as if it hadn't occurred to him to do otherwise, as if he had been around long enough that social performance seemed like more trouble than it was worth. "Can I buy you a coffee?" he asked. Maya looked down at the cup in her hand. "I have one. You haven't drunk it." She looked up. He was watching her with that deep, unhurried attention, and she had the sudden vertiginous sense that he saw considerably more than most people did. Not in a threatening way, in the way of someone who had learned, over a very long time, to actually look at things. "Yes," she said. "All right." They sat at a wooden table near the edge of the square, under a tree that had gone gold and was shedding leaves in slow handfuls. Adrian bought her coffee and something hot for himself that he didn't drink, and they talked. Or she talked, mostly, which surprised her because she was not generally someone who talked. He asked questions that were simple on the surface, and somehow led somewhere real about her work, about what had brought her to nursing, about whether she liked the city or had simply ended up there. She found herself telling him about her mother, about the boxes still packed in the second bedroom, about the gap that grief leaves that you keep almost falling into when you stop paying attention. He listened the way very few people did without waiting for his turn to speak, without preparing his response. Just listening, his dark eyes steady on her face, present in the way of someone who understood that being witnessed was not nothing. "You've lost someone," Maya said eventually. It wasn't a question. Adrian was quiet for a moment. A leaf came down between them and settled on the table. "Yes," he said, more than once. "Recently?" No. A pause. Not recently. She waited. He looked at the leaf on the table, and she watched something move through his expression, not pain exactly, more the shape pain leaves behind after it has been carried long enough to become simply part of the landscape. You get used to it, he said quietly. That's the worst part. You get used to it, and then you wonder what that says about you. Maya wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I think it says you kept going, she said. That's all. There's no indictment in surviving. Adrian looked at her. Something shifted in those dark eyes. Not the ghost smile this time. Something quieter and more complicated. No, he said after a moment. I suppose there isn't. They stayed at that table for 2 hours. The market moved around them, noisy and ordinary and alive, and Maya could not have told you afterward what specifically they talked about, only that the conversation had the quality of something rare, the sense of two people finding, unexpectedly, that they are operating on the same frequency, that the same things seem important. That silence, when it came, was comfortable rather than something to fill. When she finally stood to leave, the market was thinning, the stalls beginning to pack up. Adrian walked with her to the edge of the square. They stopped at the corner where their directions diverged. The boxes, he said. In the second bedroom. Maya looked at him. Don't let them sit too long, he said. In my experience, the longer they wait, the heavier they get. She stood with that for a moment. How long did yours wait? Adrian looked down the street, at the gray city going about its morning. Long enough, he said, that I learned not to make that mistake again. He said goodbye simply, no performance in it, and turned and walked away, and Maya watched him go, and thought that she did not know a single thing about this man that was ordinary, and that she intended to find out more. She opened one box that afternoon. It was the smallest one, a shoebox she had carried all the way from her mother's house in Riverside, wrapped in a sweater so it wouldn't rattle. Inside, a watch that had belonged to her grandfather, a letter in handwriting she recognized but couldn't read without her throat closing, a photograph of her mother at 22, standing in front of a car that no longer existed in a city that barely did, squinting into the sun and laughing at something off camera. Maya sat on the floor of the second bedroom with the photograph in her hands for a long time. Then, she put it on the windowsill where she could see it. She texted the number she had saved under his name. She wasn't sure exactly when she had gotten it, only that it had happened naturally, the way things do when both people are paying attention, and said only, opened one box. He replied 4 minutes later, good. Then, after a pause, how was it? She typed back, hard and then, necessary. He sent back nothing for a moment and then, those are usually the same thing. She smiled at her phone in the empty second bedroom, and the boxes around her felt slightly less like a verdict. They fell into something over the following 2 weeks that she could not immediately name. Not dating. Or not only that it had a different texture, something more like two people carefully learning the shape of each other. They met for coffee twice more. He cooked dinner for her in an apartment that was spare and immaculate, and suggested someone who had lived in many places and learned not to accumulate. She brought wine she chose too carefully, and talked too much about the hospital, and apologized for it. And he said don't apologize with a certainty that stopped her mid-sentence. He was generous with attention and sparing with information about himself, and Maya, who was a good nurse, and therefore a good observer, noticed this. She catalogued the small things that didn't add up. The way he moved too fluid, too quiet, the economy of it belonging to something trained rather than natural. The cold of his hands when they brushed hers passing a dish, a cold that didn't make sense in a warm room. The way he tracked movement in a restaurant without appearing to look, the way he always positioned himself with his back to the wall. And the age in his eyes. That most of all. Whatever Adrian Voss was carrying, it was older than any man of 35 had a right to carry. She filed these observations and did not yet open them. What she opened instead was the second box. Then the third. He didn't offer to help, and she didn't ask him to, but he was there the evening she went through the last of her mother's books, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea he held without drinking, simply present while she pulled volumes from the box and set them on the shelf, and sometimes had to put them down for a moment before she could continue. She was a reader, Maya said, holding a paperback whose spine had been broken and repaired with tape. What did she like? Stories where people found their way home. Maya turned the book over in her hands. She said the world was hard enough without endings that couldn't make up their minds. Adrian was quiet. What do you like? She asked. History, he said, after a pause. I find it clarifying. Because it's already over? He looked at her steadily. Because it shows you what survives. Maya set the book on the shelf. She turned and leaned against it and looked at him across the small kitchen, and in the warm light of the apartment he looked, for a moment, almost like someone at rest. Almost like someone who had set something down. Adrian. Yes. Are you going to tell me who you are? Actually? The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car passed. The refrigerator hummed. Adrian looked at her with those deep, impossible eyes, and Maya watched him make a decision. She could see it, the way you can see weather coming, the particular quality of a moment about to change. Not tonight, he said, but yes, I will tell you. She held his gaze. Promise? I don't make promises I can't keep. That's not what I asked. A pause. The ghost smile, but different this time, something in it that hadn't been there before. Yes, he said, I promise. Maya turned back to the bookshelf and kept working, and the apartment held them both in its warm light, and neither of them spoke again for a while, and the silence was the kind that means something is beginning rather than ending. He told her on a Friday, 3 weeks after the farmer's market. They had walked along the river after dinner, the city lights fractured across the water, the air sharp and cold and smelling of rain that hadn't arrived yet. Maya had her hands in her coat pockets, and Adrian walked beside her with that characteristic stillness, present without crowding her, attuned without pressing. She had known it was coming. She had been carrying the knowing of it for days, the way you carry an unopened letter because you understand that opening it will change something. He stopped at a bench overlooking the water and sat down, and she sat beside him, and he was quiet for a moment in the way that precedes something real. How long have you been a nurse? He asked. 6 years. She paused. You know this. And before that, pre-med. Then I changed course. She looked at the water. I wanted to be with people, not above them. Adrian nodded slowly. He looked out at the river, and in the cold light she watched the planes of his face arrange themselves into something careful and resolute, and she understood this was not a preamble. This was the thing itself. Beginning. I was born, he said quietly, in what is now Eastern Hungary. In a winter I won't date precisely because the date would require an explanation I'm not ready to give yet. A pause. It was a very long time ago, Maya. She didn't speak. I am not going to explain everything tonight. There's too much, and some of it requires context that takes time to build. He turned his head and looked at her. But I won't lie to you. I decided that when I came back to the hospital. I've had enough centuries of navigating around people to understand that it costs too much, and what it costs is the only thing that matters the truth of what's actually between two people. Maya sat with that. The river moved past them, indifferent and ancient. Centuries, she said. Yes, how many? His jaw tightened slightly. More than 6. She absorbed this. The rational, trained part of her mind ran through explanations and discarded them, one by one, the way you triage symptoms until only the diagnosis remains. The cold, she said. Yes, the way you move. Yes, you never drink anything I make you. Something crossed his face. I should have been more careful about that. You weren't, because you wanted me to notice. She watched. Some part of you wanted me to ask. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said quietly. I think that's true. Maya looked back at the water. The rain had begun, Very fine, more like mist than weather, catching in her hair. She thought about her mother's books and the stories where people found their way home. She thought about warmth in a cold corridor and the particular quality of being carried. She thought about grief and what it did to a person over decades, over centuries. "Are you dangerous?" she asked. "I can be. No hesitation. To people who threaten what I protect. Have you hurt people?" "Yes, long ago. People I should not have." His voice was even, carrying old weight. "I'm not going to tell you otherwise. But not now. Not in a very long time." He paused. "I learned control the way you learn anything difficult badly at first, and then better, and then well enough that it stopped being the defining thing." Maya turned to look at him directly. Rain caught the light between them. "Why me?" she asked. "Of everyone, in however many centuries. Why come back for a nurse who fainted in a hallway?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful, as if the words were something that needed to be handled with precision. "Because you had a sticker on your badge," he said. "A small yellow smiley face, half peeling off. And you were lying on the floor of a hospital, having given everything you had to people who needed you, and there was this sticker, which meant that at some point in the day you had chosen to put it there. To still do that, despite everything." He stopped. "I have seen a great deal of the world, Maya, across a very long time, and what I have learned is that what survives is not power, not intelligence, not even love in the abstract. What survives is people who still put stickers on their badge on a hard day." The rain came down soft between them. Maya looked at this ancient, impossible man sitting on a bench by the river and felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite wonder, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "That," she said at last, "is either the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me, or it's the truest." She met his eyes. "I haven't decided yet." His hand moved, slowly, and covered hers where it rested on the bench between them. Cold and steady and careful. "Take your time," he said. She turned her hand over beneath his. "Tell me about Hungary," she said. And he did. He spoke for a long time, there by the river in the soft rain, and she listened in the way she had noticed he listened to her, without interruption, without hurry, letting the words find their shape at their own pace. He told her about winters that were different from modern winters, colder, longer, and more absolute. He told her about a world organized around different fears, different gods, different ways of understanding what the dark held. He told her about the night it happened. He did not use dramatic language. He was past the need for that, the way a single encounter in the forest beyond the village had changed the terms of his existence so completely and so permanently that the man he had been before it was essentially a different person. Someone he had known once, and now remembered with a particular distance, a very old loss. He told her about the centuries that followed, about learning what he was, and what that meant, about the long, painful education of restraint, about the people he had known and lost to time, the way every human connection eventually described the same arc arrival, warmth, departure, how he had responded to that, at different stages, differently, long periods of isolation. The monastic existence he had developed in the last 100 years, moving through cities like a current through water, present and traceless. The work he did, preservation work, historical artifacts, the kind of quiet archival labor that suited someone who remembered the originals. "You said you lost people," Maya said. Specifically, a pause. "Yes, more than friends." "Yes," he looked at the water, "twice in the way you mean. Once in the 17th century, a woman I believed I had no right to love and loved anyway. She died of fever. Common then, devastating, always." Another pause. "Once more recently, 70 years ago. She knew what I was. She chose it with full information. She died in the war. The weight of that settled between them. Maya was quiet, giving it room. You blamed yourself, she said finally. For the first, not the second. He turned to look at her. She made her choice clearly. Removing someone's agency in order to protect yourself from grief is not love. It's something smaller. Maya held that. And yet, you've been alone since. Yes, not by logic then, the ghost smile, tinged with something rueful. No, not by logic. She understood that. She understood it in the specifically embodied way of someone who had done the same thing, on a much smaller scale, for 3 years since her last relationship had ended, and she had quietly, efficiently redirected all available energy into work. She had called it focus. She had called it dedication. She had not called it what it was. I'm not her, Maya said. Not accusatory, just precise. No, his voice was very certain. You're not. I know the difference. How? He considered. Because when I saw her, I thought here is something I want. And when I saw you, he paused. Something careful and honest in his expression. I thought here is someone I don't want to walk past. She let that in. Let it take up the space it needed. The rain had stopped at some point without her noticing. The city had gone quieter around them. Maya looked down at their hands, still together on the bench, his cold and still, and hers warming slowly from the inside out. I need you to understand something, she said. Tell me. I'm not looking to be saved. I don't need to be carried off floors and placed gently on couches. She met his eyes. I mean, I needed it that night, physically, but I'm not someone who wants that as the arrangement. I know. I'm tired. Not broken. Those aren't the same thing. I know that too. His thumb moved once, slow, across the back of her hand. I didn't come back to the hospital because I thought you needed saving. I came back because I wanted to see someone who put stickers on her badge still in the world, for purely a pause that held something like dry humor selfish reasons. Maya laughed, surprised. It came out real and unguarded, and she felt it crack something loose in her chest that had been set too long in one position. That, she said, is the most honest thing you've said. I'm practicing, he said. I told you I'm out of the habit. They walked back along the river as the city settled toward midnight, and their conversation moved into simpler things, the names of bridges, the history of buildings, stories he told about places he had known when they were young. She asked questions, and he answered them, and she understood that this was a man learning, carefully, to let someone in again. And she understood because she was doing the same thing, and the parallel of it felt less like coincidence than like something that had been waiting with considerable patience for them both to be ready. At the corner near her building, he stopped. I don't know how to do this at a normal speed, he said. I'm aware of that. Normal is overrated, she said. I mean, I have the tendency to either remain at a complete distance, or he paused, seeming to choose the word claim. There is not always a great deal of middle ground. Maya looked at him steadily. Then, we build the middle ground, she said. That's what people do. Something in his face shifted, opened slightly, the way a window opens in a house that has been closed too long. Yes, he said, as if the simplicity of it was something he was still processing. I suppose that's what people do. She went inside. She stood in the elevator with her back against the wall and her eyes closed and felt, beneath the exhaustion and the complexity and the rational voice itemizing every reason this was unusual, something quieter and more fundamental, the sense of standing at the beginning of something, not the careful managed beginning of someone protecting themselves. The real kind. She went back to work the next morning and did not tell anyone. What would she have said? There was a man. He was very old. He had carried her off a hospital floor and come back the next day, and she was fairly certain she was going to fall in love with him, if she was being precise about the direction of travel. She did not tell Dolores, who would have had many questions. She did not tell her friend Priya, who would have asked for photographs. She kept it in the private part of herself, the quiet interior room she had always maintained, and she took it out sometimes during long shifts when her feet ached and her patience was thin, and looked at it the way you look at something good to remind yourself that the world contains good things. He texted her while she was on shift. Small things, a question about a painting in a gallery nearby he thought she might like. A note about the rain. Once, a single line, still thinking about Hungary, and then, a minute later, that was more sentimental than I intended. She had replied, "Don't revise it." I liked it, and had felt him across the city, across whatever span of years and difference separated them settle. Slightly. She met his friend on the third week. She hadn't known he had friends. He existed so completely in his own solitude that the idea of him within a social world seemed almost incongruous, and so she was unprepared for the man who met them at the wine bar Adrian had chosen, with characteristic precision, quiet, not crowded, corner table, sight lines to the door. The friend's name was Callum. He was lean and silver-haired, and possessed of a quality of watchful amusement that suggested he had found, in the course of a very long existence, that most situations were inherently comedic if you waited long enough. He stood when she approached the table and took her hand and said, "I've heard a great deal about you," in a way that made Adrian, sitting across from him, say Callum with a warning note that was somehow the most human thing she had seen him do. "He talks about you," Callum confirmed, settling back into his chair with transparent delight. Which is notable, because he has not, historically, talked about people. "Historically," Maya said. "He means literally," Adrian said. "I do," Callum agreed pleasantly. She liked Callum immediately, which she had not expected. He was sharper than he appeared, and funnier than he let on, and he regarded Adrian with the deep, easy affection of someone who had known him for long enough that fondness had become structural. He asked her questions about nursing with genuine interest, and when she described a complicated case from the previous week, she saw something in his eyes shift into the focused attention of someone who knew medical histories firsthand, from the inside. "How long have you two known each other?" she asked. A look passed between them. "Long enough," Adrian said. 240 years, Callum said, at the same moment. Another look. "Give or take," Callum amended. Unrepentantly, Maya picked up her glass. "And in 240 years, she said to Callum, 'What's your assessment?'" Callum seemed to genuinely consider this. He turned the question over with the care it deserved, and she respected him for not producing an easy answer. "That he is," Callum said eventually, "the most stubborn, most principled, most deeply inconvenient person I have had the misfortune to genuinely care about." A pause. "And that the last time I saw him look at anything the way he looks at you, it was at a sunrise after a very long night." "Which is not nothing." Adrian said his name again, quieter this time, and Callum smiled into his wine, satisfied, having delivered his line, and no more. Walking home afterward, Adrian was quiet in the way of someone processing mild embarrassment, which Maya found so genuinely charming that she pressed her shoulder against his just briefly as they walked. "He's good," she said. "He's a menace," Adrian said. "He loves you." A pause. "Yes," he said, and the softness in the word was not performed. "He does." She thought about 240 years of friendship, about what it meant to know someone across that span, to have been present for each other through the whole slow turning of centuries. She thought about her mother, who had been her best friend, who had been gone 3 months, and about the particular shape of that loss, not just grief for the person, but grief for the witness, the one who had known you longest, who carried the archive of who you had been. "Do you know what I miss most?" she said. He listened. "Being known," she said. "My mother knew everything. The embarrassing things, the wrong things, the history of me. And when she died, all of that, the known part, went with her. I became someone with no record." Adrian stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify, something old and new at the same time, something that hurt a little to look at, in the way that things that matter often do. "You are not without record," he said. "Not anymore." She understood what he meant. She understood the specific weight of it, what it meant for someone with his memory to say that. She looked up at him in the city dark, the streetlights making halos in the damp air, and something in her chest completed a turn it had been making for weeks. "Adrian," she said. "Yes, I'd like you to kiss me now." The ghost smile arrived and stayed. "I'd like that too," he said, "if you're sure." "I'm a nurse," she said. "I'm always sure." And he kissed her, there on the street in the autumn night, careful and unhurried and entirely present. The way he did everything, with the quality of someone who understood that this moment was not practice for something else, but the thing itself. Maya closed her eyes and felt the cold of him and the warmth that lived beneath the cold, and thought, without irony or qualification, that she was glad she had fainted in that hallway, that she was glad she had been that tired on that night in that corridor. Some things, she thought, find you when you stop running fast enough to be found. The threat arrived, as threats to things worth having often do, without announcement. It was a Sunday. Maya was at Adrian's apartment, reading on the couch while he worked at the desk near the window, cataloging something from a crate that had arrived that morning. She had learned the shape of his work patient, meticulous, the handling of old things with a care that was not performance. She had begun to understand that his relationship to the past was not academic. He was not studying it. He was, in some fundamental way, still in it. The knock at the door was 3 sharp raps. Deliberate, not a knock that carried any uncertainty about whether it would be answered. Adrian went still. Maya looked up from her book. She had not seen him go still like that before, not the calm stillness of his ordinary presence, but something else, the coiled attention of an animal that has caught a scent. His eyes were at the door, and something in his face had reorganized itself into something older and harder than the man she spent her days with. "Stay here," he said low. "Adrian, please." He crossed to the door and opened it before another knock could come. The man in the hallway was pale and precise, and wore his clothing with the careful elegance of someone who had learned that appearance was a weapon. He was perhaps Adrian's apparent age, or a few years younger, with light eyes that held, when they moved from Adrian to find Maya on the couch, a quality of assessment that made the hair on her arms rise. "Brother," the man said. The word had no warmth in it. Adrian said nothing for a moment. A muscle in his jaw moved. "Dorian, you've become careless," Dorian said. His gaze moved back to Maya. "I can see why. This has nothing to do with her. That," Dorian said pleasantly, "is entirely up to you." He looked back at Adrian with those pale, evaluating eyes. "The council has been patient. 600 years of patience is, I think you'll agree, more than generous. You can't keep hiding yourself in plain sight forever, Adrian. They want an answer. They have my answer. They want a different one." Dorian tilted his head slightly. "Things have changed. The alignment is shifting. There are those who believe you're a brief pause that waited the next word precisely. Capabilities are going to be necessary, and those who believe that if you won't commit them willingly, the question of willingness becomes irrelevant." The apartment was very quiet. Maya sat with her book in her lap and did not move, and watched Adrian at the door, and saw something she had not seen before, not in this form, the full weight of what he was, worn without concealment. Not the careful man who measured his words and moved quietly through the world. Something older and considerably more dangerous, worn openly, like a coat taken off a hook after a long time inside. "You came here to threaten her," Adrian said. "Say it plainly." Dorian smiled, and it was nothing like the ghost smile she had come to love. "I came here to remind you what's at stake," he said. "The rest is your inference. Get out of my house." "Think carefully," Dorian said, with the tone of someone who is not leaving because of the instruction, but on his own schedule. "The council convenes in 3 weeks." Your presence, his eyes moved to Maya again, briefly, deliberately, or your representatives would be expected. He left. Adrian closed the door. The silence after was its own kind of pressure. Maya set her book down. "Counsel," she said. Adrian turned from the door. The hardness in his face was dissolving back into him, the way a wave recedes, but it left something behind, not softness, but its shadow. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been managing a very old problem for a very long time. Yes, of vampires. Yes, who want you for something. They have wanted things from me for a long time. He came back to the room, sat in the chair across from her, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. I was before I left, before the life I have now. I held a position, authority, within our governance structure. I walked away from it 3 centuries ago because what they were asking me to do conflicted with what I could justify to myself. And now, they want you back. They want my compliance. There is a faction that intends to operate in ways that will affect the human world significantly and not well, and they want the endorsement of my name and whatever I represent. His jaw was tight. I have refused. I will continue to refuse. But Dorian is not wrong that the question of willingness may eventually become irrelevant to them. Maya looked at him steadily. He was threatening me. Yes, to get to you. Yes, the word was flat and carried a weight of self-recrimination in it that she wanted to challenge. I should have been more careful. I should not have don't, she said. He stopped. Don't tell me you should not have let me in, she said. Don't reframe this as a mistake you made. She held his eyes. This is a problem. We solve problems. That's different from a mistake. Adrian looked at her for a long moment with that deep, unguarded attention, and she saw in his face the specific effect of being surprised by someone, the way it opened something up, briefly, that has been held shut. You're not afraid, he said. I'm extremely afraid, she said precisely. That's not the same as leaving. She did not leave. She went home that night, because she needed to think, and Adrian needed to make calls. She heard that word from him for the first time, as she was getting her coat. Calls, said with the weight of someone deploying something significant, and she walked through the city streets with her hands in her pockets and her mind running the situation with the same methodical triage she applied to a full ward. Facts, Dorian knew where Adrian lived. Dorian knew about her. A council of old and powerful beings had an interest in Adrian's compliance and had identified her as a point of leverage. These were the facts. She arranged them in a row and looked at them without flinching. Then she went home and slept, because she was a nurse and she had learned that you cannot function in a crisis on no sleep, and whatever was coming would require her to function. Adrian called at 7 in the morning. Are you all right? Yes, are you? I've been making arrangements. A pause. There are people, others, like me, who are not aligned with the council who I've been in contact with. Callum is one. There are more. We have resources. What do you need from me? A pause. She could hear him processing the question, not the shape of it, but the spirit of it, the fact that it was a practical question rather than a frightened one. Right now, he said, I need you to go about your life without changing anything. Don't signal that you know there's a threat. Go to work. Come home. Live normally. The moment we change our patterns, we tell them that their move landed. Poker, she said. What? That's a poker strategy. Yes, he said, and she could hear the ghost smile. I suppose it is. She went to work. She did her shift with the focused competence of someone who had decided that the best possible response to fear was excellence, and she was good at her job in the particular way that people are good at things they have genuinely dedicated themselves to, and it carried her through the 12 hours with something to show for it. Dorian appeared on the 3rd day. He was in the parking structure. She saw him as she was walking to her car after a late shift, standing near the stairwell exit with his hands in his coat pockets, and that precise, assessing expression. And Maya stopped, and took a breath, and decided in the space of that breath exactly how to handle this. She walked toward him. He seemed surprised by that. She saw it a small recalibration, the adjustment of someone whose model of her had just been updated. "Miss Reeves," he said. "What do you actually want?" she said. She kept her voice level and professional, the tone she used when she was telling family members things they did not want to hear. Not the theater, the actual thing. Dorian regarded her. "I want Adrian to attend the council session and confirm his support for the new alignment. And if he doesn't, then the council will ensure that the things he values become complicated, by which you mean me." He tilted his head. "I want you to hear something," Maya said. She stepped closer, close enough that she had to look up at him, and she held his pale gaze without looking away. "I have watched people face the worst things available. I have held hands at the end. I have seen what fear does to people, and what courage does, and what love does, and I know the difference." She paused. "Adrian is not going to comply because you threaten me. That is not who he is, and I am not going to become someone who makes him smaller out of self-preservation." She paused again. "So whatever you're planning, plan it knowing that the leverage you think you have doesn't work the way you think it does." Dorian was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his pale eyes, not respect exactly, but the revision of an estimate. "You're very certain," he said, for someone who's known him 8 weeks. "Some things don't require time," she said. "They require attention. I've been paying attention." She walked past him to her car. Her hands were shaking, but she did not let them shake until she was inside with the door closed. And then she gripped the steering wheel and breathed through it. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the way she told anxious patients to breathe. And after a minute, her hands were steady again. She called Adrian. "He came to me," she said, before he could speak. Silence then, quiet and controlled. "Where are you?" "Parking structure. In my car. I'm fine." "What did he say?" She told him. Precisely, accurately, without dramatizing. When she finished, there was a silence that had a quality she had not heard from him before, not cold but contained, something being held very firmly. "Maya, I'm fine," she said again. "What you said to him," he said. "Did you mean it?" She looked through the windshield at the concrete columns of the parking structure, ordinary and solid in the fluorescent light. "Every word," she said. The silence shifted. Something in it changed, the way temperature changes the same air but different. "I'm coming to you," he said. "You don't, I'm coming to you," he said again, simply, and ended the call. He was there in 12 minutes. He came through the stairwell door and across the structure to her car, and she got out to meet him. And he stood in front of her for a moment looking at her face, with that full present attention, and then he put his arms around her and held her, and she held him back, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said that wasn't already in the holding. The council session was in 2 weeks. Adrian spent those 2 weeks in the kind of focused preparation that Maya recognized the orientation of someone who is committed to a course of action and is now engaged in the practical labor of making it possible. He met with Callum, with others she was gradually introduced to, a quiet network of old beings who had each, in their own time, decided that certain things were worth standing for. She was not excluded from these conversations. That was what she noticed first, that Adrian did not manage her or protect her from information. He brought her into the room, sat her at the table, let her hear the full dimensions of the problem. When she asked questions, they were answered. When she offered observations, the nursing instinct toward patterns and anomalies serving her in unexpected contexts, they were listened to. Callum, across the table one evening, caught her eye and smiled with an expression that said, "I told you so," without any of the words. "What exactly does the new alignment want to do?" she asked, during a session where the full shape of it was being laid out. The answer was not simple, but the core of it was. There were those within the council who believed that the current arrangement integration, concealment, the long, careful project of coexisting within human society was no longer worth maintaining, that it was time for a different ordering of things. "And what do they need Adrian's endorsement for?" she asked. Legitimacy, said a woman named Vera, who was small and white-haired and had been alive, Maya gathered, since approximately the reign of Elizabeth I. Adrian represents a lineage of governance that predates the current council. His name carries weight that theirs does not. So, he's symbolic. To them. Yes, Maya looked at Adrian. How symbolic? He met her eyes. Symbolic enough that my refusal, formally made and formally witnessed, carries as much weight against them as my compliance would carry for them. She understood. So going to the council isn't conceding. It's the opposite. If I go on my own terms, with my own witnesses. His jaw was set, with the refusal made clearly, on record, in front of everyone who needs to hear it. Yes, she looked around the table. Callum, Vera, two others whose names she was still learning. A small room in a city of millions, and at the table the specific gravity of people who had decided something mattered enough to show up for it. I want to come, she said. The room went quiet. Maya, Adrian said. I have thought about this, she said. Which she had, methodically, during 3 consecutive night shifts. I'm not asking to be heroic. I'm asking because my being there matters strategically. She looked at Vera. You said he needs witnesses, people who will make the refusal real and public. She looked back at Adrian. I am someone who will not be intimidated. I am someone who stood in a parking structure and told Dorian to his face that his leverage doesn't work. Bringing me is not vulnerability. It's demonstration. A silence. She's not wrong, Callum said, with the tone of someone who has been waiting for the room to catch up. She's in danger, Adrian said. She's in danger either way, Vera said, not unkindly. The question is whether she has agency in it. Adrian looked at Maya for a long time. She looked back and did not fill the silence with reassurance, because she was not in the business of managing his fear at the expense of her own clarity. She had made her case. The decision belonged to them both. You're sure, he said finally. I told you, she said. I'm a nurse. I'm always sure. She saw Callum press his mouth together to contain something. Vera looked at the table with a small, careful smile. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the resolution was there, not easy, not without cost, but present. All right, he said. Together, then. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and held it. Together, then, the night before the council session, they sat in his apartment with the lights low and the city moving outside the windows, and he told her stories not about councils or politics or the long wait of centuries, but small stories. A harbor he had loved in the 15th century, a book he had read in a monastery in winter, by candlelight, that had changed how he understood patience. A dog he had kept for 14 years in the 18th century, a ridiculous and enormous hound who had been afraid of birds. She told him about her mother, the full version, not the summary, the particular way she laughed, the things she cooked when Maya was ill, the argument they'd had the week before she was diagnosed that Maya had been carrying like a stone for months and had never told anyone. She knew you loved her, Adrian said when she finished. How can you know that? Because you are the kind of person you are, he said simply. She made you. She knew what she made. Maya sat with that and felt something loosen, very slowly, the way ice loosens in the first warmth of spring, not all at once, but genuinely. They did not sleep. They sat through the night in the warm apartment and talked and were silent and talked again, and outside the city moved toward morning, and when the first gray light came through the windows, Adrian looked at it, and then at her, and the expression on his face was one she would remember long afterward, someone who had not expected to see a particular morning and was entirely, simply glad to be wrong. The council met in a building that had no signage and appeared, from the outside, to be a disused commercial property in an industrial quarter of the city. Inside, it was different. Not opulent, nothing about the old ones ran to opulence, she had noticed. Or, if it had burned away over time, leaving something more spare and considered. Stone floors, high ceilings, the quality of a space that had been used for serious things for a long time. They arrived as a group. Adrian first, then Maya, at his side, then Callum and Vera and the others. And the room was already occupied perhaps 30 beings, some of them old enough that Maya could feel it without being able to explain the feeling. A pressure in the air like the low frequency before a storm. Dorian was there. He saw her. And his expression did what she had hoped it would do, recalculated, adjusted, registered the message her presence was sending. She met his eyes and held them, and then she looked away first. Not from defeat but from indifference, which was a different thing entirely and harder to counter. The proceedings had a formality she had not expected. An older language beneath the surface of it, the residue of structures that predated most of the institutions humans considered ancient. There were those who spoke for the alignment, their arguments polished with long preparation, and there were pauses and responses, and the particular energy of a room where power is being negotiated by people who have been negotiating power for a very long time. When Adrian stood, the room went quiet in a specific way, not the silence of deference exactly, but of attention. The weight Vera had described was real, and she could feel it in the room's stillness, the particular quality of people being forced, against their preference, to actually listen. He spoke for 11 minutes. She had heard pieces of what he intended to say, but not the full form of it. The clarity and precision with which he laid out his refusal and its basis. He did not shout. He did not perform. He spoke the way he did everything with the economy of someone who had learned that truth stated plainly was stronger than truth decorated, and the room could not look away. He named what the alignment intended. He named what it would cost. He named the history of every previous attempt at this kind of dominion, and where each had ended, and he named it from memory that was not academic, that came from having been present, having watched, having carried the knowledge across centuries. And then he said, "I refuse. Formally, before these witnesses. Let the record carry it." The room was very still. Then Callum said, "Witnessed." Then Vera. Then the others, one by one. Maya said at last. Her voice was steady and clear in the stone room, and she felt Adrian, standing beside her, go very still at the sound of it, as if the word in her voice carried a specific weight it hadn't in the others, as if something was being confirmed that he hadn't dared to fully believe. Dorian spoke after, with the smooth, controlled tone of someone absorbing a setback and recalibrating. He made it clear this was not over. He made it clear the council would revisit. He made it clear, with elegant and pointed language, that the presence of a human at these proceedings was irregular and would be noted. "Note it," Maya said, from beside Adrian, clearly enough that the room heard. Dorian looked at her. "Note all of it," she said. That's the point. Something shifted in the room. She felt it not victory, not resolution, but the specific sensation of a weight being redistributed, of a balance point being found. The alignment had wanted compliance, had wanted a symbol to appropriate. What they had gotten instead was a refusal made public and permanent, witnessed by old names that carried old authority, and the testimony of a human woman who had walked into their room unafraid. You could not easily undo that. That was the calculation, and she had done it carefully, in 3 consecutive night shifts, and it held. They left together, all of them, and the night air of the city outside was cold and ordinary and smelled of rain, and Maya breathed it in and felt, under the adrenaline and the residual fear, something that was simply true, that she was glad she had come, that she had done something that mattered, not because she was fearless, but because she had been afraid and come anyway, which was the only version of courage she had ever believed in. Adrian stopped on the pavement outside and turned to her and looked at her for a long moment and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the looking didn't already carry. "Don't," she said, before he could start. I wasn't going to you were going to say something self-recriminating about having put me in danger. A pause. I was going to say thank you, he said. She looked at him. In the streetlight, his face was pale and still and entirely present, all the weight of centuries visible, and somehow not heavy. Not tonight. Oh, she said. Thank you, he said again, simply. Maya stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held her against his chest in the cold street, his arms around her with the specific quality she had first felt in a hospital corridor, without knowing what it was like being held by something that does not intend to let go. Like being, for the first time in a long time, exactly where she was supposed to be. Callum walked past them and said something she didn't catch. Vera, passing in the other direction, put one brief hand on Maya's shoulder, a touch that carried the communication of one woman to another across an absurd span of years. The city moved around them. They stayed. Spring came slowly to the city, the way it always did grudgingly, in increments, a warm day followed by cold followed by rain, as if the season couldn't quite commit. Maya noticed it in small ways, the light lasting longer in the evenings when she came off shift, the tree outside Adrian's window putting out pale green against the gray sky, the farmer's market fuller on Saturdays, the stalls bright with early things. She had moved half her books to his apartment. She had not announced this as a decision. It had happened organically, over weeks, 2 or 3 volumes at a time, until one morning she had looked at his shelves and seen her things woven into his, and felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with loss. The boxes in the second bedroom were gone. She had taken 3 weeks in January, working through them on her days off, and Adrian had been there for some of it, not intruding, not managing her, just present in the next room, within reach if she needed him, absent from the room itself when the work was private. He understood the difference between being with someone and being on them, and she loved him for it with the specific gratitude of a person who has been crowded in grief before and knows what it costs. She had said "I love you" first. She had not planned to. It had arrived in the middle of a Tuesday evening while he was reading, and she was eating toast over the sink, and she had simply said it, out loud, without ceremony, because it was true, and true things didn't need staging. He had looked up from his book and gone very still in the way that meant something was arriving in him that he was not prepared for, and then he had set it back, quietly and completely, and she had gone back to her toast, and he had gone back to his book, and the apartment had held them both in its warm and ordinary light. The council had not moved against them. Dorian had sent, through intermediaries, a communication that Adrian described as the political equivalent of agreeing to disagree, which in the context of beings with long memories was a reasonable temporary arrangement. The alignment had not dissolved, but had lost momentum. The refusal, witnessed and on record, had done what she had calculated it would do, complicated the narrative in ways that were difficult to undo. There would be more of it. She understood that. She was not naive about the nature of very old problems or the patience of very old enemies. But she had also learned across a long winter and a slow spring that the future being uncertain was not the same as the future being lost. That building something in the shadow of difficulty was not futile. That, in fact, most things worth having were built exactly there. She went back to the hospital every shift and did her work, and came home and did her life, and put a new sticker on her badge, a small blue star this time, and did not think of it as defiance or symbol, but simply as the thing she did. The small, persistent choosing of color against the gray. One evening in April, she and Adrian walked to the farmer's market, the same route as the first time, the same coffee cart, the same wooden table under the tree that was now fully in leaf. They sat across from each other with their drinks, and the spring light came through the new leaves and made patterns on the table, and he was telling her something about a translation he was working on, something in a language she didn't know, and she was watching his face while he talked, the aliveness in it, the way he had been learning over months to let it show. She thought about the corridor, the floor, the clipboard spinning across the tile. She thought about Dolores and her efficient concern, and the saline drip, and waking up somewhere warm without knowing how she got there. She thought about a man who had stood in the middle of that, and decided, quietly, to come back the next day. She thought about her mother's books, and the stories where people found their way home. "What are you thinking?" Adrian asked. Maya looked at him across the table, in the spring light, at the face she had come to know. "That I'm glad I was tired," she said. He looked at her, that deep, still attention. "Tell me." "I worked too much and ate too little and ran myself down until I passed out in a hallway," she said. "And you were there. And you came back." She held his gaze. "I'm glad I was tired, Adrian, because if I hadn't been, I'd have walked past you without knowing." He was quiet for a moment. The market moved around them, ordinary and alive. A child ran past with a balloon. The coffee cart steamed. Someone laughed at the next stall over, the sound bright and careless in the spring air. "I've been walking past things for centuries," he said quietly. "I had learned to consider it a skill." And now, his hand moved across the table and covered hers. Cold and warm beneath the cold. "Now," he said, "I'm relearning the opposite." Maya turned her hand over and held his, and the spring light came through the leaves and lay across them both, and the city went about its life around them, loud and indifferent and full of people who didn't know that at a wooden table in a farmer's market sat a nurse who had fainted in a hallway, and a vampire king who had decided, after 600 years, that the middle ground was worth building after all. She squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back. That was enough. That was everything.